First I go with a short speech, and then you, and then we go for coffee break because the director of the Skopje University canceled. She canceled. That's why. Yeah. Yeah. You delete her. You delete her altogether. Ne, tukaj je zboram. Dear friends, can we start? We let some extra time to get to know each other and to welcome us in an informal way. Later on, we are going to have a longer coffee break in order to continue our talk. But now let me address you as the head of the Global Changes Center, the organizer of this, I would immediately say, wonderful event. Having seen all of you that arrived from different parts of the world, took terrible long flights and ordeals on your way. But here we are, and I'm very happy to welcome you all. As you know, the Global Changes Center is a research unit of the Faculty of Philosophy at the St. Cyril and Methodius University in Skopje. That is the oldest, and we usually say the best university in our country. But unfortunately, although it is mentioned it was planned in our agenda that the rector of the university is going to address us, last night she had to cancel due to some unforeseen duties. Here I'm going to talk on behalf of the center, but also of our co-organizer and really a very dedicated assistant in organizing the event. That is the Chamber of the Immigrants from Macedonia, Matica na Iselenici, and we are very grateful for their assistance throughout this process. Many of you would remember that the idea about this conference started maybe a year ago when we actually, as international board members, met at our first Zoom meeting. It was somewhere in the fall last year, and we discussed the future of this research center. And one of the ideas was to organize a major international event in order to meet each other in person, to discuss very important issues, and to foster our future cooperation. That was already a very heavy, difficult time, very painful time, and I still remember that many of us talked about the situation, grave situation in Gaza. 1 year later, we are in a much, much worse situation. It's a genocide. We have escalation of the situation in the entire region, not to mention other parts of the world where there is no conflict prevention or negotiations to get to peaceful outcomes of the conflicts, ongoing conflicts. So honestly, as the time was going on, we were busy organizing the event, trying to actually attract more sponsors, donors who are going to assist us, because obviously our ambitions were high and we wanted to prove to be good hosts. Here is my great thanks go to the Chinese embassy and our Chinese friends that really helped us a lot and helped all of us to be here today. Apart from these organizational issues and communication with all of you, we were all aware that things on a global scale were going to an opposite direction to what is the main title of our conference. It is like an irony of the fate that we planned to talk about cooperative multipolar system, how to use the opportunity of the changing global arena and new actors, and how to channelize, how to make these things work in a way to produce peace, development, peaceful coexistence among nations and states in the world. Unfortunately, we know what happened some days ago, and as I mentioned, a year already. So at some moments, I was really scared and I feared that the title of our conference is maybe wrong, or how shall we discuss cooperation amidst war and human suffering of unprecedented scale. Then, of course, there was a concern about many of you, how would you manage to get here? Luckily, most of you, 99% are present, and I'm very grateful for that. But we have some last-second changes in our program because many of our participants found themselves in different places in the world, even some in the most dangerous places. This morning I tried to get in touch with Professor Marandi, who is a speaker in the second panel, who is supposed to join us online. And honestly, up to this moment, I have no feedback, because last time he called from Beirut. And I just hope that he is well and safe, and that he's going to join us. Professor Jeffrey Sachs was also announced as one of important speakers on our event, but he also appeared to have some busy schedule and promised to send a video greetings and excuse actually to all of us, because we were really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about the latest developments. But so far, I still haven't heard from him. My last information was that he was going to Bahrain upon invitation of His Majesty, the King of Bahrain, of that country. So I am just preparing for maybe some slight changes in the agenda, but luckily the main keynote speakers are all here, and we are going to have a great debate, I'm sure. So let me not take much of your time. I would only welcome you once again and wish you a pleasant stay in Skopje, fruitful debate today and tomorrow. Let's exchange our contacts and explore possibilities for future cooperation. And that would be all from me, because I'll take the floor a few more times during the conference. And now it is my great honor to give the floor to our representative from the Chinese Embassy in Skopje, People's Republic of China, in capacity of chart d'affaires, Mr. Xie Li. Please take the floor, and you can address the audience free or there, wherever you like it.
So thank you. I would like to address in Chinese, and there will be a translation. 尊敬的全球变革中心主任万科夫斯卡，尊敬的复旦大学教授张维为一行，and Your Excellency, Mr. Sergey Vesniki， 各位专家学者，大家好，很高兴出席合作的多极体系和新型国际秩序国际研讨会。首先，我谨代表驻北马其顿使馆对此次研讨会的顺利举办表示衷心祝贺，对来自中国和北马等国的专家学者表示热烈欢迎，对会议组织方全球变革中心表示诚挚感谢。本次会议以合作的多极化和新型国际秩序为研讨主题。当前， 国际大变局进入加速演变期，世界多极化、经济全球化深入发展，全球治理体系和国际秩序变革加速推进，新兴市场国家和发展中国家快速崛起，国际力量对比深刻调整。但各方对需要什么样的多极化、建立一个什么样的国际秩序看法并不一致。在此我愿提出几点看法。一是倡导平等有序的世界多极化，推动完善全球治理。我们主张国家不分大小强弱，权力平等、机会平等、规则平等，在多极化进程中平等参与，享受权利，发挥作用。解决国际上的事情应当由各国一起商量，世界的前途命运应当由各国共同掌握，而不是由个别或少数大国垄断国际事务，不是以所谓实力地位把国家分成3、6、9等。各国都要在以联合国为核心的国际体系内行事，在全球治理的进程中加强合作，共同恪守联合国宪章宗旨和原则。中方始终视欧洲为多极化进程中的重要一极，支持欧洲一体化，支持欧洲战略自主。中国愿同包括北马在内的各国一道，推动世界多极化、经济全球化朝着各国人民期待的正确方向发展，推动全球治理朝着更加公正合理的方向迈进。二是弘扬全人类共同价值，推动构建人类命运共同体。今年7月召开的中国共产党20届3中全会强调，践行独立自主的和平外交政策，推动构建人类命运共同体，践行全人类共同价值，落实全球发展倡议、全球安全倡议、全球文明倡议。作为全球南方的成员，中国已同150多个国家携手共建“一带一路”，同100多个国家和联合国等国际组织推进全球发展倡议合作。不久前举办的2024年中非合作论坛峰会上，习近平主席就中非携手推进现代化提出6大主张，这对引领全球南方加快实现现代化、推进世界现代化产生重大而深远的影响。面对全球化挑战，中方主张以和平发展超越冲突对抗，以共同安全取代绝对安全，以互利共赢摒弃零和博弈，以交流互鉴防止文明冲突，以绿色发展呵护地球家园，建设一个持久和平、普遍安全、共同繁荣、开放包容、清洁美丽的世界。三是践行和平共处5项原则，推动构建新型国际关系。今年是和平共处5项原则发表70周年。当今世界，乌克兰危机、巴以冲突延宕不止，地区和全球和平赤字、安全赤字不断加剧。和平共处5项原则摒弃传统的以强凌弱的丛林法则，顺应各国对更加公正合理的国际秩序的共同期待，也体现了以相互尊重、和平、公平正义、合作共赢为原则的新型国际关系。加强与发展中欧关系是中国推动建立新型大国关系的重要组成部分。今年5月，习近平主席访欧时指出，中欧双方应该坚持伙伴定位，坚持对话合作，深化战略沟通，增进战略互信，凝聚战略共识，开展战略协作，推动中欧关系稳定健康发展，为世界和平和发展不断做出新的贡献。今年是中华人民共和国成立75周年，在中国共产党的坚强领导下，中国经济社会发展取得了历史性成就，发生历史性变革，中华民族迎来了从站起来、富起来到强起来的伟大飞跃。今日之中国正在坚定不移以中国式现代化全面推进强国建设、民族复兴伟业。面对世界之变、时代之变、历史之变，我们愿同北马在内的世界各国携手同行，推动构建人类命运共同体，携手建设更加美好的世界。谢谢大家。
Before I invite all of you, I see the coffee is already served. We will have some time until 11 o'clock when we continue with our first session with our 4 keynote speakers. But let me just make another comment. Now, as we started, I can see around, and unfortunately, I can notice that there are very few journalists. All of them were correctly, in a timely manner, invited to be present today, but I just see a few of them. Unfortunately, I have to say welcome to NATO land. We are talking about multipolarity, it's a blasphemy, and many people are afraid even of mentioning the word multipolar order. So, but anyway, we are in a good company. And let me just correct myself. I missed greeting all the guests to express my special thanks to the presence of His Excellency, Ambassador Sergei Beznyukin from the Russian Federation, who is here to honor us with his presence. And I hope that he's going to have also a chance to share something of his thoughts with us later during the debates. Of course, we have our Russian colleague in the second panel. So we try to really show how diverse and how rich is our world, how many people and good-willing people live on this planet. So let's do it. Let's have a good conference. Let's have a good start. Thank you all. Maybe we should just have this family photo at the beginning. If you agree, I don't know, the photographers would say this is a good position to get closer here. Huh? Hold it.
Yeah, to read. Small plane, they said, please give your luggage in. And I was very hesitant, and they said, and so I wasn't planning to.
I will go second. Okay.
And they said, no, it's fine.
Okay, that's great.
It's never happened before. But it may turn out.
So when I go on, he should just bring up the first slide. Oh no,
Yes,
I will,
and then
I will.
So maybe it will come back.
ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Okay. Now we have all precondition for continue our conference and start with the working part of the international conference. At the beginning, I just have to be honest in front of all of you, because when I found out that I will moderate this panel with our esteemed guest, I felt in the mix of stress and exciting emotion. Yeah. How the conference coming closer and closer, the value of exciting was bigger. So, also, after considering various ways to introduce our esteemed professors, I realized that not special introducing is needed. Why? Because they're already widely known in academic circles as leading thinkers on the conspiracy and argumentation of the multipolar world order. Still, in brief, it is a great pleasure to welcome Professor Zhang Weiwei, who will open this session. who is a prominent Chinese academic and political scientist, widely recognized for his work on Chinese political model and its global rise. He is a professor of international relations at Fudan University in Shanghai and serves as a director of the China Institute at the same university. Professor Wei Wei is a vocal proponent of China's unique governance model, which he refers to as civilizational state. He argues that China's model of governance, rooted in this distinct history, culture, and socialist principle, differs from the Western liberal democracy and, in his view, often surprises in the effectiveness, particularly in delivering long-term stability and economic growth. So, ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts because our scientific journey begins now. Professor Wei Wei, please take the floor.
Thank you, Tony, for your warm introduction, and thank you, Bijana, for organizing this great event. And it gives me great pleasure to come to Macedonia again. And for me, it's a second visit to Macedonia. Actually, I have some attachment to former Yugoslavia. That's one way I came to Macedonia many years ago and come here again. I was back in the 1980s, exactly in 1986, I was an interpreter for Chinese leaders. I came with the Chinese Prime Minister to Yugoslavia. We went to Belgrade and Slovenia. So we had a very good impression of Yugoslavia at that time. And it's at that time much more developed than China. We thought perhaps one day we'll become like Yugoslavia. Of course, later I checked, even at that time, Yugoslavia was already in some troubles, decentralization, and many problems. But indeed, at least on surface, it's so impressive. It impresses each and everyone, including Chinese leaders. And so when the breakup of Yugoslavia occurred, indeed, it affects the feeling of many Chinese. And I made a decision. At that time, I was based in Geneva. I was a senior research fellow at the Asian Society, Geneva Center for Asian Studies. And then I made a trip on my own. I went exactly in the year 2006, 20 years, 2 decades after my first visit. I traveled all the way from Belgrade, from Slovenia, down to Macedonia and Kosovo, so all the former republics. And then I wrote a long piece called the By Yugoslavia in Chinese. And I did not expect, at that time we just had blogger, with social media at the very beginning stage. 2,000, 3,000 comments after reading my piece. And so I can sense, many Chinese have this kind of consensus that the breakup of Yugoslavia is something the Chinese have difficulty to accept. And that will come to my subject on civilizational state. It's a larger country, unified for many years, in the case of China, for more than 2,000 years. And so this national unity for Chinese is very important. I remember when we were in Belgrade, we were invited by our host to the Three Hats restaurant. And the Yugoslavian music group sang this patriotic song. We were deeply impressed. He said, Tito said we should be united as one, whatever. But in the end, we feel that the power for disintegration actually became bigger than power for integration. That's something, Chinese, we have learned a lot from the breakup of Soviet Union and breakup for the Yugoslavia. We made serious study on that. And most Chinese will not accept this breakup of their country. This is national unity is a theme in the case of China for thousands of years. That's how to explain why Taiwan should be unified with the Chinese mainland. So I'm also glad that this particular conference coincides with the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the founding of People's Republic of China. And so I think I will share my thoughts on this hugely important topic of China's rise and the cooperative multipolarity. With 75 years of socialist construction, China has become the world's largest economy by purchasing power parity since 2014, so exactly 1 decade. And today, China is the largest industrial, manufacturing, and trading nation, with the world's largest middle class. And China has also eradicated extreme poverty. And China's life expectancy for this huge country, 1.4 billion people, is already 2 years higher than the United States. If you look at the statistics, even in per capita terms, the daily consumption of protein and daily consumption of vegetables in China is higher than in the United States. So this is a remarkable change under socialism, under leadership of Chinese Communist Party. Very impressive. And furthermore, thanks to the Chinese model of socialism, we have roughly accomplished one industrial revolution every decade. So the past 4 decades, we really accomplished roughly 4 industrial revolutions in one. And now China at the forefront of the new industrial revolution, the 4th industrial revolution. AI, big data, and quantum technologies. China and United States and the premier camp. And I think China perhaps has better foresight than the United States, better future than the US in terms of the new industrial revolution. All these are important because when we talk about multipolarity, I think multipolarity is already there. But what needs is multipolar world order. This is something in the process of emerging, and we should strive for. And with this kind of the rise of China, with 4 industrial revolutions in one, China is the only country today that can provide all the goods, services, experiences from all the 4 industrial revolutions. This is a game changer and transformative, very important. Why, when China pushed this BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, 11 years ago? Because China has both hard power and soft power to do that. In terms of hard power, we can help, say, a very poor African country like Chad to build from zero to a petrochemical industry. They have petrol resources, oil resources. Within 2 years, we deliver a petrol production line for them, from drilling of oil to producing chemical products. And soft power comes to that as well, a lot of soft power. So this is important, I said, this kind of foundation for building a multipolar world order. Furthermore, as Tony just introduced, I raised this concept of civilizational state. China is very unique. It's the world's longest continuous civilization. This civilization state means it's an amalgam of the world's longest continuous civilization with a super large modern socialist state. This again is transformative, it's a game changer. And sometimes I try to distill the key features of this state, civilizational state, China. I said super large population, super vast territory, super long traditions, and super rich cultures. What's important is in every of these features, there is a blend of old and new, ancient and modern. And this makes China case extremely interesting. For instance, when we talk about this super large population, 1.4 billion people, it's a historical inheritance. China has been a populous country for thousands of years, yet this population is well educated. Every year, we produce more engineers, more scientists, more technical staff, whatever, than the Western countries combined. If you talk to Huawei, they said if there is a technical problem, we use 1,000 engineers to tackle them. If it's not working, 10,000. It's a press exaggerated, but it's the case. You have this engineer bonus. Just an example to show this ancient and modern. Same with vast territory. Again, it's inherited from China's past. It's a super large country. Yet, from the past, this history, this ancient, but it's also very modern. It's connected with the world's best, most advanced railway system, bullet train system, and also superhighways. What's more important is first-rate digital infrastructure. China today accounts for 70% of global 5G stations. So I can tell you in honesty, I was in Paris in May. The Wi-Fi connection in Paris, in downtown, Xinjiang, Tibet are better than downtown Paris in terms of Wi-Fi system. You can watch video on your way in the highway, any place. It's a typical case of what we call the mixed economy. State sector responsible for infrastructure. Each and every village must have 5G stations, services. And then Chinese non-state sector, private sector, maximize this infrastructure to deliver this e-commerce service. So this is a typical case of how Chinese model has worked. Same with super long traditions. For instance, we discussed political tradition. China has a long tradition of meritocracy. China invented public servant examination system 1,000 years ago. And so today's Chinese political system is still based on what we call selection plus election. If the Western system about election, China put selection first. You must be at least have governed 100 million people by the size of China. Say 2 terms as a major governor of a major province, or 2 provinces, or 3 provinces, before you came to the top echelon of the leadership. So arguably, I'll be very certain, Chinese leadership is among the most competent in the world today. And same with super rich cultures. Again, if we talk about political culture, Chinese culture is very much influenced by Confucianism. And Confucianism emphasizes a lot on people's livelihood. The government and governance should for the people. What we call is people's livelihood first. Whatever policies, political, economic, social, they should all boil down to delivering tangible service goods to the people, both in material terms and non-material terms. So all this means a civilizational state, both ancient and very modern, and this is extremely important. And then we come to its implication for the global governance and for this unipolarity moving towards multipolarity. In the first place, why we should have a multipolarity? Because unipolarity is unjust, immoral, and unfair, and sometimes even criminal. In the sense that if you look at under unipolarity, everything, virtually everything, from dollars to trade to technologies to climate change, can be weaponized. Sanctions, missiles, color revolutions are the norm and used routinely, and causing wars, havocs, and untold human sufferings for millions upon millions of the people. So unipolarity is, if we use the famous phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Unipolarity is absolute power. So it has to be changed. It's being changed in the process. Then I would see, if you look at the world today, in fact, multipolarity or multipolar world is already there. If you compare the BRICS with the G7, BRICS is now 10 members, represents roughly 29% of the world's GDP in purchasing power parity, and G7, 21%. So it's already different. So BRICS is a pole, including China, Russia, India, and other countries itself are co. And despite even internal difference among global South, among global East, yet there is one consensus. All of them stand for multipolarity, not unipolarity. So this unified consensus on building, on working towards multipolarity, this is very important. And then I said, we have already a multipolar world, but we haven't got a multipolar world order. This is in the process of emerging, and we should speed up this process, including our conference today. That's something we should do, we should try hard. So in the first place, you will have to use the term soft power and hard power, which I don't like very much, but we can use it to express certain ideas. And then use the Chinese idea we call the comprehensive power. A blend of hard power and soft power constitutes a comprehensive power, which can be very important for building of this unipolarity. In terms of soft power, for instance, the Western idea is divide and rule. The Chinese don't accept that. We don't buy this. We believe unite and prosper. Within China, we do that. Beyond China, we promote that. Good example is BRI. Everywhere unite. We hope Middle East will be united, and Africa will be united, and former Republic of Yugoslavia will be united. It's not easy, but I think it's the better approach. And China, ASEAN are also very much united. Same with, we talk about shared future for mankind, one human community. This is very different from American philosophy of on the table or in the menu, totally different. And furthermore, what's important is, more specifically, if we compare the difference between China and the United States, the two superpowers, United States philosophy is a Cold War mentality, friend or foe. It asks other countries to follow the United States or pick sides. You have to be with us, otherwise you are our enemy, friend or foe. Chinese philosophy is very different. From a civilizational state, our philosophy is a friend or a potential friend. We have much longer time frame. Give example, at this moment, the Filipinos, from a Chinese point of view, are making a lot of troubles in South China Sea. Yet, Chinese approach and the American approach are different. Yes, we try to solve this problem, but peacefully. And I was asked by a foreign reporter on this issue. I said, compare China and the United States. When the United States became the largest economy in 1890s, it launched war against Spain and occupied Philippines and Cuba as its colonies. China became the world's largest economy in 2014, a decade ago, by purchasing power parity. But even today, China said, we prefer negotiated solution to territorial disputes. Even for this troublemaker Philippines, we at maximum only use the water cannons. In fact, both sides have shown restraint. That's something which outsiders fail to note. Because in this region, I'll come to that, China and ASEAN, a good example of cooperation. And furthermore, China does not have the American imperial tradition or the imperial tradition of the West. Even when China was much stronger than Europe, say in the 15th century, when China's navy, led by Zheng He, went to overseas. It's 80 years before Columbus' discovery of America, yet we did not colonize any countries. So this is not Chinese philosophy. And Chinese philosophy is we build a great wall to ward off invading enemies. So that's very much the Chinese approach. Another good example is if you look at this nuclear strategy. China exploded its first nuclear device in 1964. And China immediately declared China will not be the first to use nuclear weapons and will not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. If all the nuclear powers can do that, there'll be no threat of nuclear wars. Yet, as a civilizational state, China is a super modern state, and China has very powerful defense capability. I always tell my American friends, and we are a country with the highest threshold for using military force. Yet we always have very clear red lines, which no foreign country can cross. I said during the decades of the Cold War, there was no direct hot wars between United States and Soviet Union. But there were two major military confrontations between China and the United States. The Korean War in the 1950s and Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s. Hot wars happened between the two countries. Yeah. In the end, we know what's the result. Even not long ago, last week, China tested its first, after 44 years, its long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, exactly 12,000 kilometers. It's a clear warning, as Chairman Mao said, we should talk in a language that your opponents understand. There's some warmongers talking about using technical nuclear weapons against China. You don't know what will be the end result. It's very important. And then, having said this about this philosophical background of civilization state, which could be very useful for the building of the multipolar world order, cooperative world order, I will come to some specific examples, a few cases. I'll only mention them briefly, given the time available. In other words, a cooperative world order, a cooperative multipolarity should be and can be established. And we tried this out already in Asia. If you look at the Munich Security Conference report for this year, the title is lose-lose. In fact, Europe has lost peace, has lost development, has lost prosperity. Economy is in recession. But in Asia, Asia is so big, I confine myself to China plus ASEAN, 10 members of Southeast Asia. Because ASEAN is often called the Balkan of Asia. Very diverse in terms of ethnic composition, religious composition, and racial composition, and ideological differences, and political differences, whatever. Yet, in China and ASEAN, this bloc is a bad word, in this region, we have achieved win-win, almost 5 decades of peace, development, prosperity. Now, this region is a center of development and center of security and world's largest free trade area. It's impressive. I think we can really teach a lot to our European colleagues. I will go to Geneva in 2 days. I share them a bit of this Asian wisdom, how we do it. Yeah. Soft power and hard power. Same with BRI. It's again already $1 trillion invested, 5,000 projects, 150 countries participating. Obviously, it's game changer. Yeah. And I remember EU Foreign Policy Representative Borrelli made a comment not long ago. He said, if you look at Global South today, in all these areas, ideology, military, economic development, and technology, Global South has alternatives. This is important. I do mention other major Global South countries like Russia, India, other countries. China alone can offer in these 4 areas. Yeah, if you look at economic development, many small countries do trade with China alone. That's enough. Yeah. And same with technology. The United States launched stupidly this tech war against China. Yeah. We prefer this tech environment. United States is strong in designing of chips. Japan is strong in material for chips. South Korea is very strong in memory chips. China, Taiwan is very strong in testing and other ways. But with this tech war, China produced everything on its own. The whole, from material to design to whatever. Okay, yeah, in 2 minutes. So I think this is very important in the sense that we have the reason for optimism, because in Asia I've tried. Don't forget, China plus ASEAN is a population of more than 2 billion people, more than 3 times of the European population. We have achieved peace and prosperity. And I will have no time to discuss how we have done that, but inspiring to the world, to this multipolarity. In other words, I try to say, with hard power and with soft power, and I use the Chinese phrase, these two combined, we call the comprehensive power, not only from China, but also from other global South countries, from all those who want to join this new cooperative world order. I think we can share this. In the end, we can find and build a win-win cooperative multipolar world. And so the lose-lose approach symbolized by the unipolarity will be the norm. The more they do that, the more failure they are going to experience. Europe now is a case in point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wei Wei. Now we have our second keynote speaker, Professor Radhika Desai. Also very short introduction. Professor Radhika Desai is an expert in political economy, geopolitics, and international relations. She is a professor in the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba, Canada. And at the same time, the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. Her research focuses on global political economy, multipolarity, and the decline of United States hegemony. Professor Radhika, please take the floor.
Can I have the slide?
Yes, please, the first slide.
Okay, so first of all, I would just like to start by thanking Biljana really for 2 very important things. One is to take this very important and courageous initiative to set up the Global Changes Center, of which this is, I believe, the inaugural conference. And I think this is particularly important because never, I think, so I've entitled my talk, Crisis of Western Imperialism, Opportunity for the World Majority. And I would like to say, as Professor Zhang Weiwei was speaking, I thought I would begin my speech by saying that Professor Zhang has given us an extremely wonderful, beautiful moral case for multipolarity. And now I want to present a historical case for the same thing. In other words, perhaps in an analogy with what Frederick Engels did a century and more ago, he showed how previous socialists like Robert Owen or Fourier or Saint-Simon had made a moral case for socialism, but his was going to be a historical case for socialism. Okay, so let's dive right into it. Few can doubt that the world's inherited institutions of international economic governance, erected after the Second World War, are in profound crisis. Sanctions, populism, friendshoring, de-risking, the deepening division of the world into two opposed camps, trade wars, technology wars, and wars pure and simple, like the ones that are going on precisely in this neighborhood, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Ukraine, and elsewhere. These are among the proliferating causes. The crisis is said to be one of multilateralism, by which is meant the practice of international negotiation among a large number of the world's countries, if not all of them, to conclude common agreements for mutual benefit. Those who label the crisis in this way call for a revitalization of this practice. However, multilateralism is actually thriving. The world majority, that is to say, the bulk of the world which is not included in the West, have tired of waiting for the imperialist West in its current dangerously petulant huff to demonstrate its much-touted multilateralism, and is getting down to the business of negotiating a still expanding set of alternative institutions, whether of trade or credit or investment or payments. And there is more to come in the upcoming BRICS summit in Kazan later this month. The United States-led West, by contrast, and I will use the term to refer to the imperialist core of the world economy, as it was when the capitalist imperialism peaked in 1914, plus a small number of hangers-on that it has acquired since, as most clearly seen in a map of the countries that is imposing sanctions on Russia today. So this US-led West, which has for so long arrogated to itself the title of the keeper of the flame of this multilateralism, appears including by diminishing its allies' empires. As Karl Polanyi put it in a remarkably insightful article in 1945, the United States wished to return to a pre-1914 system of universal capital So that was the United States on the one hand. The opposed force was the rest of the world, which consisted of the United States' war-torn allies as vulnerable. The story of the establishment of the structures of international economic governance after the Second World War is intelligible only if we understand that they were the outcome of an ongoing clash between these two principles of US supranationalism, sometimes helped by its allies and sometimes hindered by them, and the multilateralism of the rest of the world. The best way to understand US supranationalism is to understand that it as economically cosmopolitan. The German mercantilist theorist Friedrich List used this expression in the mid-19th century to describe the sort of world order as envisaged by the then dominant capitalist country, Britain, designed a world opened up through formal or colonial or informal semi-colonial control for its commodities and capital, and to supply it with cheap commodities and labor. To this, List opposed the international world. So the cosmopolitan world is on the left here. It has no borders. It is simply a world over which the privileged, which can be controlled from London or New York or what have you. List, however, proposed a different type of world. To List, the world was international, a world of nation states, because he understood, as well as many others, including the United States' own Alexander Hamilton and mercantilists like Henry Carey, like Marx, like Keynes, and like today's development state thinkers, that a world in which some nations have already industrialized and therefore can command world markets, the only way for further industrialization development in other nations, the only way for them to escape the fate of being subordinated to the dominant capitalist countries, of being their hewers of wood and drawers of water, is through the use of protection. And the entire slew of policies, infant industry protection, industrial policy, directed credit, export promotion, subsidies, tariffs, capital controls, among others. While such state-directed industrialization projects may fail, indeed we can see from the record of post-war attempts to develop in the Third World that there is absolutely no guarantee that they will succeed. No development is possible without them. This was as true in the late 19th century, when Germany, the United States itself, and Japan industrialized, as it was after, when the Soviet Union did, and in the mid and late 20th centuries when European economies and Japan recovered, or in the 60s and 70s when South Korea and Taiwan province industrialized, as it is true today as we see from China's industrialization. I will say parenthetically that it would be very useful to bear in mind that the word globalization is used in China in a very different way than it is used in the rest of the world, especially in the US-led world. In the latter, it means basically free markets and free trade, whereas in China, it means more trade through managed trade. The suppression of this truth, the truth that List identified, has been the overriding ideological mission of the West. If the ruling ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling classes, the ideas the ideas that serve their interests and maintain their power, then the ruling ideas about a world order would understandably tend to be those of the dominant powers, that is, there being no world state. These ideas also tend to be useful in perpetuating their dominance, in particular by mystifying the real sources of national wealth and power. To retrieve this truth and propagate it, I have proposed geopolitical economy as a new way of understanding world affairs. This is a book I wrote in 2013, and a very important quote of Marx, which you will see the significance of as I talk. Not only does geopolitical economy take the division of the world states into nation states and national economies, and between imperialist countries and those resisting them seriously, but it regards both divisions as structurally necessary to capitalism. It returns to Marx's original understanding of capitalism as contradictory value production, which is forgotten by most Western Marxists and most Marxist economists who derive their understanding. To Marx's original understanding of capitalism as contradictory value production and his understanding of international relations as the relations of producing nations, hence not geopolitics and geoeconomics, but geopolitical economy. It considers imperialism to be rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. It considers anti-imperialist resistance by those nations that capitalist imperialism would subordinate as inevitable, and as therefore expressing the contradiction of capitalist international relations. It considers, like Marx, both nations and classes to be agents of history, contrary to so much Western Marxism, which does not take account of nations at all. Marx says here, if free traders, he said this in 1848 at the height of the version of Marxism, which is generally touted by so-called Western Marxists as being globalist before its time. Can grow rich at the expense of another, we need not wonder these same gentlemen refuse to understand how within one country, one class can enrich itself at the expense of another. This shows that for Marx, nation and class were two agents side by side, working together to make history. A geopolitical economy further considers the resulting dialectic or struggle between imperialism and anti-imperialism to be the principal motor that has driven the evolution of the capitalist world order since its beginnings. We can also think of it as a struggle between what Trotsky called uneven development, which privileges imperialism, and combined development, which constitutes a response to it in the form of state-led development. Between the denial of development, which is the essence of imperialism, and the pursuit of development, which is the essence of anti-imperialism. Between the complementarity that imperialist countries would impose between their own high-value production of technologically sophisticated goods and the low-value production of the subordinated world, and the latter's efforts to establish a similarity of productive structures. Further, geopolitical economy argues that in the contest between these two forces, the anti-imperialist side has tended to prevail, slowly but also steadily, making the world ever more multipolar, and that this meant that though some sort of British dominance was inevitable because Britain was the first industrial power, it was also short-lived and unrepeatable, and that the United States had the misfortune of being able to attempt to emulate that sort of dominance only after the world had already become multipolar, and hence had already made such attempts unsuccessful. And of course, the US was also fated not just to face challenges from other capitalist countries, but also from socialist ones. Geopolitical economy finally considers the anti-imperialist resistance of national states no less essential to advancing humanity along the path to socialism, or a vision of egalitarian, prosperous, ecologically sustainable, and peaceful cooperative world under any other name. If you don't like socialism, you can call it whatever you like. So it considers this anti-imperialist resistance as being as important as the struggle of classes, women, peoples struggling against exploitation and oppression, an understanding which we and my colleagues and I, my friends and I, also managed to voice in the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. The geopolitical economy of the post-war system of international economic governance was the result, therefore, of the clash between US supranational or cosmopolitanism and the rest of the world's multilateralism, aiming to accommodate their need to breach liberal principles in the interests of recovery, socialism, and development. The principal parameters of the outcome of this clash can be briefly listed. The US desire to construct a liberal world order of the pre-1914 sort could not be fulfilled. The United States' ambition was always thwarted. It had to accept the creation of a United Nations, and though it corrupted its one nation, one vote principle with the permanent members of the Security Council, it had to its goal, had to include within those 5 permanent members the Soviet Union and China. And of course, the creation of such a United Nations also led the United States to create NATO as an alternative institution for the furtherance of its supranational ambitions. Though the US used its war-wrought power to prevent any alternative to the dollar, such as Bancor, issued by a multilateral international clearing union as proposed by Keynes, from being realized and left the world with no alternative to the dollar, it had to agree to continue backing it with gold, and it had to accept capital controls. It could not prevent it had to agree to a multilateralist ITO, the International Trading Organization, and though Congress failed to approve it, the fallback GATT also operated on a multilateral basis and eventually had to not only accommodate European needs of recovery and therefore manage trade, but also further in the 1970s during the Tokyo round, the Third World's demands for a new international economic order. Though the US scored its biggest victories with the IMF and the World Bank, securing vetoes for itself in their design, they would remain relatively obscure until their heyday in the 80s and 90s. And the communist world remained outside these institutions, at least the IMF and the World Bank, which they saw as branches of Wall Street. We cannot examine the evolution of these institutions in any detail here, but 2 points may be noted. The Third World push for multilateralism culminated in the demands for the new international economic order, or many of these demands, to be realized in the Tokyo round of GATT negotiations. And the 1980s, and particularly the 1990s, witnessed a short-lived phase of US supranationalism. However, this period remained brief. By the early 2000s, people were talking about BRICS, and by the 2010s of multipolarity. The WTO, despite its supranational proclamations, remained primarily multilateral rather than supranational, and the planned multilateral agreement on investment was never realized. So, to conclude, what is today called the crisis of multilateralism is in reality a crisis of US supranationalist cosmopolitanism or US imperialism. That crisis has been long in the making and has reached something of a climax today. Though the crisis today takes a violent and conflictual form, thanks largely to the refusal of the United States and some of its allies to understand and accept the new world that is emerging with good grace, it is also allowing true multilateralism to emerge from under all these conflicts that have been caused by this refusal to accept. So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Desai, for your excellent presentation. Now we have our third keynote speakers, Professor Richard Sakwa. He's a prominent scholar specializing in Russian and European politics. He's currently an emeritus professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent, Great Britain. Sakwa has extensive expertise in the politics of post-communist states, with a particular focus on Russia, European security, and the crisis of the post-Cold War international system. Professor Sakwa, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you mind if I stay
Yeah.
here? Yeah. First of all, I will also echo what the previous speakers said, and thanks very much to Biljana. And it's marvelous, finally, to make it to Macedonia, to make it to Skopje. It's long been my ambition to do so, so it's fantastic to be here today, and also within the framework of the Global Changes Center, which I think is a fantastic initiative as a forum for discussion of the emerging, as it were, the winds of change of how things are developing. So we wish the center every success. In my comments today, I'm going to try to deal with four connected issues. The first one is hegemony, the notion of hegemony. The second is multipolarity. The third is the concept of Cold War. And the fourth is the actual culture or cultures of Cold War. And so in a few minutes, I want to tie these concepts together. The first one, hegemony. Now, hegemony has a long, long history. I know that there's a huge debate in China, for example, and there has been all the way even before the warring states time about the notion of leadership, dominance, and ultimately the character of power. So this is a debate which has been not just an Anglo-Saxon debate, and it's huge in the Anglo-Saxon international studies literature, and not just in Western discussion, the Peloponnesian War, which of course was very important about Athens and Sparta, but of course other cultures, China, and of course the Indian culture. So in other words, the way we look at hegemony needs to be widened from our Anglo-Saxon or Eurocentric perspective. And it's ultimately, and for our purposes today, the fundamental issue is hegemony the same or equivalent to empire? What is the nature of leadership in that system? And obviously, my focus is that system established in and after 1945. Is this dominant political order or formation of our times, which I call the political West. It's important to identify the subject of the major processes in international politics today. This is more precise, in my view, the notion of a political West, than the term, for example, the collective West, which Moscow is very keen to use, and others who talk about liberal hegemony, which is far too vague in my view, or Eichenberg's talk about a liberal international order. When we identify this political West, we're talking about a political formation that was established and shaped by the Cold War. And in that context, in a minute I'll talk about it, the Cold War itself, but this is something which was established beginning in 1945, when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was both the last act of the old world, if you like, and the first act of this new world of permanent Cold War in which we now live. And so that moment, the 1945 moment, is fundamentally important. And so this political West, is this Atlantic power system, if you like it, is a world order in contemporary jargon, which up until between 1945 and 1989, it had an opposition. It had the Soviet Union as an alternative model of world order. After 1989 or 91, the Soviet Union obviously disappeared. The second world, if you like, disappeared the Soviet Union, and as the Chinese would have added to that, the European dimension also was marginalized, and some people call it vassalized within this Atlantic power system, within this political, US-led political West. After 1989, this political West, which was shaped by Cold War, and during which we saw in the United States the transformation of the American political state, that, there's a large literature about this, and if you remember that communist Eisenhower, in his farewell address, condemned the military-industrial complex, we saw the emergence of what Michael Glennon calls the Trumanite state, a national security state, which dominates to this day. Ben Rhodes calls it the blob. John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, endless number have talked about how the US state has changed since, or transformed as a result of the Cold War, and the foreign policy today is dominated by the Uni-Party, the liberal interventionists on the Democratic side, the neocons on the Republican side, but ultimately having a bipartisan foreign policy which is indistinguishable one from the other, but an enormous element of continuity. After 1989, this uni-state, if you like, this Trumanite military security, ideological propaganda state, media, academic, all hugely involved in it, radicalized. And I don't have time, but I've talked about this before. But it's fundamentally, even this transformation of the US state went global. And so it wasn't just globalization of the sort which Radhika has just discussed, but it universalized, which is a different concept. Before 1989, hardly anyone even used the word globalization. And then afterwards it became, universalism. That was the geoeconomic side of things. The universalism was the political side of it. And there were 5 radicalizations going on. Very briefly, the Hegelian. This was the end of history, that there is no viable or legitimate alternative to Western modernity, to Western civilization. The second one is the Kantian, Immanuel Kant's radicalization, the elevation of human rights, as Samuel Moyn calls it, the final utopia, forgetting social, economic development, social equality, inclusive societies in the sense of economic inclusion, instead of which you see the marginalization of trade unions, you see the marginalization of collective bargaining, collective devalorization of labor itself. The dignity of labor is reduced. And so human rights as an abstract takes the place, and of course accompanied by the vision of perpetual peace, which of course takes the form of perpetual war. Also, which takes us the third radicalization, Hobbesian, the war of all against all. This is a vision of international politics which is always about win-lose. It's about dominance, hegemony. It's about, some people could call it imperialism. It's this vision, this Hobbesian struggle, this vision of the world as a Hobbesian, endless element. Of course, Thomas Hobbes was writing under the impression of the English Civil War, and that was war of all against all, and therefore you needed this hegemon, this Leviathan dominant over it, and the Leviathan, of course, is the political West. The vision that without this political West, without the Washington-led West, the whole world would descend into disorder. Of course, it generates disorder itself by seeing the world in that way. So this Hobbesian radicalization, the fourth radicalization, let's call it Hayekian, you could call it the Milton Friedmanite, the vision of neoliberalism, which replaced that dominant paradigm of the New Deal in the United States, social democracy in Western Europe, but that paradigm which gave way in the late 1970s and dominates to this day, which is a rampant market states where the state has hollowed out the developmental, not just economic development, but even the societal and human development gives way to market relations. And Milton Friedman, of course, is the apostle of that vision. And of course, it is imposed by force. Naomi Klein, of whom I'm enormous in admiration of her, already 20 years ago in her book, The Shock Doctrine, talks about this in huge detail and marvelous detail, but many, many others, of course, have talked about this. So this is the fourth one, the Hegelian or Hayekian. The fifth one is based and developed on the vision of Leo Strauss, the Straussian vision. Now, Leo Strauss, as you know, was the father of neoconservatism, but neoconservatism isn't just an ideology, it's a way of conducting public life. It hollows out the public sphere. Straussianism is ahistoricism taken to the extreme. In other words, for a Straussian, Plato is a universal. I mean, from my view, I'm a great Platonist myself, but the vision of Plato is that his truths, which are only known to a select few in his division between exogenous and endogenous truths, is that it is only a select few know what should be done, these apostles of development, and everybody else is not just mistaken, but they're also evil if they don't understand this. And the thing about Straussians is that they do not engage in debate. We have been vouchsafed the truth. We in Washington know what's what. And you who fight against it are not just mistaken, you guys are evil because you don't understand this, our ability to interpret it, the prophet, as it were, which can interpret it. Well, Straussianism is a very rich terrain to understand the deeper culture of this political West. So all this shapes, as I say, these five things. It's a sort of Straussian ahistorical hermeneutics, way of understanding the world, about understanding even knowledge. And it destroys the public sphere of debate. And of course, in a contradiction then emerges and it cannot be agonized. So very briefly, my second theme is precisely this multipolarity. We've touched about this. Now, multipolarity is, basically, it's an ideology. It's an ideology which basically says, we do not need hegemony. I mean, the way it's used today. I mean, there's a whole literature in the US, the way they use it, but I'm using it this way. It's after hegemony. We don't need that leadership that vouchsafed to the political West to impose order, to its vision of modernity, its vision of human relations in all depth. We don't need that. And it's therefore, it's an ideology, but I mean in the best sense of the term, an ideational framework. And of course, it was explicitly so when it was the modern form was first introduced by Yevgeny Primakov in 1996, the former Russian foreign minister, and he's developed it. And even I remember his first article in a newspaper, Nezavisima Gazeta, in 1996. And it led to a huge reaction by the liberals in Russia itself and in the West, because it was a challenge to precisely the dominance of this vision which I've just outlined, this hegemonic vision of post-Cold War, post-communist world order. And it was therefore, there's many elements to this ideology, the normative, which we've touched on, but just to stress one aspect of multipolarity, a very substantive one, and that is that it is based precisely on the United Nations, it's been mentioned earlier, this charter international system, this vision of sovereign internationalism. That is the ideology of the United Nations. Today there's, 193 states in the United Nations. Through this charter international system, we had decolonization. We had this charter system, with all of its flaws, has provided a vision of Westphalia plus. It's not just Westphalia, which is the emergence of states, like billiard balls bashing against each other, that Hobbesian vision of win-lose. It's actually the vision of the Charter, the UN Charter of 1945, is of, yes, sovereign states, but sovereign engaging in quite a thick multilateralism within the framework of the Charter. So it's internationalism as well. So whereas Westphalia doesn't have that dimension. So when this whole stack of US political scientists say, oh, you in China, you in Russia, you in wherever, simply and multilateralism, all you're talking about is returning to a Westphalian system. I'm arguing precisely not that. It's Westphalia, yes, plus states, sovereign states, devising their own developmental paths and paths to modernity, but within this international framework and within a very thick normative framework established by the common endeavor of the United Nations. Don't forget, the Soviet Union was a founder member. China signed the UN Declaration of January 1942. And of course, it was the other China, but it doesn't matter. China was very much part of it. India joined as a founder member, even though it was still a colony in 1945. So this charter system today, and this is by the by, to say that this United Nations Charter international system is under unprecedented challenge now. The Ukrainians say, throw it out. Israel says, throw it out. Those, and in the United States, have always been ambivalent about it. Anyway, so this is the charter system is counter-hegemonic by its very essence. And then, of course, you have, multilateralism is a materialist. We've talked about this as well before. The economic power is shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific and many things. So there's a material basis to it. It's happening. And so on. And then the structural. We talk about BRICS. We talk about other emerging political East. So the bipolar system of the Cold War I, the first Cold War, has now changed. So there is a nascent political East emerging. And one thing I want to stress here, it is not simply, this political East includes the Eurasian powers plus certain swing states from the global South. That this isn't simply anti-hegemonic, i.e. opposing the political West, and it is counter-hegemonic. It is repudiating the logic of the political West, the logic of Cold War, the logic of lose-win, the logic of bloc politics, the logic of endless militarism, and so on. So it is not, so Joseph de Maistre says, it's not counter-revolution, it's anti-hegemony. And this is at the very heart of the Russo-Chinese joint statement of February 2022, and of course the second joint statement, which also confusingly signed just recently when Putin visited Beijing, and so many other states. It's also in all the documents of the BRICS plus today, the 10 members plus 30-odd who want to join it. It's also in all the documents of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's in the documents of the Brazil-China peace plan for Ukraine and so on. In other words, this, and I stress this again, it is counter-hegemonic, counter-imperialist, counter the dominance of a single vision of modernity and so on. So I stress it is, and in that sense, of course, it is not anti-Western, it is post-Western. It is not anti-American, it is post-American. We work with many in the United States, we work with many in the West. We are even part of that. So this is my third point, just briefly, is about Cold War itself. And it's important, I mean, people keep saying, why do you go on and on about Cold War? Well, I know the Chinese are very ambivalent about the notion of Cold War. I've been to Beijing, I was there in March and earlier, and I've often been condemned for talking about it, and the Chinese, why do you talk about Cold War? It's over, guys. We're moving into win-win and so on. Lovely, marvelous. I love these development, all these Chinese initiatives. They're marvelous documents, marvelous. The reason why I say that is because, and of course, even in China, why the Chinese don't like it is because it puts them in a similar position to the Soviet Union earlier. And of course, I certainly don't mean that. It's very different. And of course, the second Cold War is very different from the first. Yet, my point is, there is a certain character of politics which is a Cold War style of politics. And this is what's condemned by all the Chinese documents, all the BRICS and Shanghai and all these counter-hegemonic documents, is that it's a style of politics in the nuclear age. That's why I mentioned Hiroshima and Nagasaki earlier. The problem is, and in a Cold War, it isn't just that we have separate interests, which is normal in a sovereign internationalism. It's endless, and you mediate it through negotiations, through diplomacy. That's what, Diderian in his great work on diplomacy precisely said. Diplomacy works when precisely to deal with states which are competing in a healthy, normal manner. Whereas in a Cold War, by definition, it's a different. The problem is not that you have different interests to us, it is that you exist, that you are challenging the very existential basis of politics. I mean, I could go on in my other notes a lot about this. It is a struggle, in other words, for hegemony. It is empire versus the rest, in which the hegemon claims to represent the interests of a broader community, that universalism which I talked about especially after 1989. But it has been a permanent Cold War, in which, in other words, my argument is that... are you sure? Okay, let me just a couple of more minutes then. Yeah. So my argument is there's been a permanent Cold War since 1945. In the first phase, Cold War I, 1945 to 1989, a cold peace, which was Cold War by other means between 1989 and 2014, and then the second Cold War in which we are today, which takes place in the foothills of the Third World War, and it's much more dangerous than that. So very briefly, my fourth and final point, I'll just list it, I won't develop it. And I was trying to stress the cultures of this Cold War. There's a hegemonic one, which includes, I'll just list it, militarism, which includes bloc politics, collective defense and not collective security, hermeticism from Leo Strauss. This is the hyper-normalization of a particular vision of the world, which denormalizes everything else. We're hyper-normal, the US-led West. Our truth is the only truth, and you are abnormal and denormalization. Anti-diplomacy, very powerful. That this is, even in the first Cold War, they didn't dismantle the institutions of diplomacy, endless expulsions of people. The ideology of democratism, which stands above democracy itself. We know what your result should be, and if you don't get it, we must have a regime change and change it to democratism. The crisis of hegemony as well, within all of that. But I wanted to stress the cultures, and my final point, is that there is a counter-hegemonic culture emerging as well. It is this one, which all these Chinese documents, which outline it, I think, marvelously. But also, above all, the counter-hegemonic one is the UN Charter itself. So we don't, to which the Chinese documents constantly refer and the Russians do. And my key point in all of this is that any counter-hegemonic formation, Russia, China, whatever, it needs to be more than just simply replicating the logic of Cold War hostility, win-lose, and so on. It needs to transcend it, both in its internal and external dimensions. So in other words, it is the biggest challenge for the political East, is to transcend and to become better than that political West which it has challenging, and not simply to replicate it. And too often, it regresses into nativism, into parochialism, into this idea of a civilization state, which is important. But at the same time, that vision runs the danger of going back into, into, how can I put it, a less... the challenge today is to devise within this counter-hegemonic formation a progressive vision of development, of peace, to utilize the huge technological and potential and biological, medical and other developments of humanity, not for the cause an endless Cold War, but for dialogue and peace and development. And that is the challenge which I think we face today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sakwa. A very interesting speech. And now we have as our fourth keynote speakers, Professor Jan Oberg. Very shortly, Professor Oberg is a Danish peace researcher and internationally recognized expert in the peace studies, conflict resolutions, and mediation. He co-founded the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future research and has been involved in promoting nonviolence, peace culture, and reconciliation for several decades. And one very interesting fact for Professor Oberg, that he's also an art photographer, and he believes in the integration of arts and peace efforts as part of a holistic approach to fostering global harmony. Professor, please take the floor.
Thank you so much. I just want to be sure that you can hear what I say. It works. It's such a pity when you've talked for 20 minutes and people say, I couldn't hear what you said. By the way, I can't speak when I sit down and I can't stop speaking when I stand up. So you have a problem in 20 minutes from now, and I know what time it is. First of all, let me thank Biljana and you, Tony, both for the center and for arranging this marvelous conference against, as far as I understand, all odds in your local scholarly world. It's very impressive, and I'm very happy to be here. And I'm happy to be here for a second reason, and that is that Yugoslavia, which doesn't exist anymore, maybe in people's minds and hearts, but not in terms of law and politics, is my third country. I was born in Denmark, lived most of my time in Sweden, and Yugoslavia is a place I was partly educated in from 1974 at the Inter-University Center in Dubrovnik, where at the time when Johan Galtung was the director of that center. And let me also say that it's a particular joy to be in Macedonia because of you, Biljana. We've known each other for more than 30 years, and you've been the pioneer in this place for peace research. I'm very happy to know you and have followed you. And also because Macedonia was a place that suffered tremendously because of Western politics here. For two reasons: the sanctions against Serbia took away the major market for the country. Nobody paid it any compensation for that at the time. And secondly, because 800,000 refugees from NATO's bombing of Kosovo and Serbia ran down here. Also, nobody helped you with that. I had the pleasure and honor at the time to speak repeatedly with President Kiro Gligorov, and he has my greatest respect. He was one of the only two leaders of former Yugoslavia who always advocated nonviolence. The other one was Ibrahim Rugova, the nonviolent leader of the Kosovo Albanians. So I'm very happy to be here, and let me rush on to what I am supposed to say. First of all, the word multipolar. I kind of think that a pole is a thing you dig down in the soil and it stands there solidly and unmovably like a Greek temple or something like that. I'm fascinated by Chas Freeman's idea that we call it nodes, N-O-D-E, node instead, or something more flexible, something more interactive, something more dynamic than poles, which sounds like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 poles, and that's the world. I think we are more intertwined than that. What we're moving into is a networking world with some nodes. What we are moving out of is unilateralism, or the unipolar world, which has always been for simple-minded people. Whereas multipolar or multinodal world is a little bit more for complex thinkers. So the Americans, of course, prefer unipolar world, but that is too simple for a world that does no longer accept that kind of thinking. And of course, the United States is on its way down. It's just a matter of how fast it will go. And there will be ample opportunities for a better world when the US empire has gone, provided it does not go down by means of nuclear war. That's what we don't know. Gorbachev was a decent leader who would not think of having used nuclear weapons when his empire went down. I'm not so sure about the Americans, and we certainly have no Gorbachev in the Western world. Third point of departure, let me quote Bernard Shaw, who said, and that applies, I think, unfortunately perhaps also to scholars, Most people look at the world as it is and ask why. And then they do all the analysis of what is wrong in the world. He didn't say that, I said that. What we should do is to look at the world as it could be and ask ourselves, why not? And that is what peace research is about, in distinction from political science or international relations, etc. We are sick and tired of just analyzing what is wrong. Without a vision, there will be no future. Without discussing how to solve problems and what it is we're heading towards, we won't succeed, in my view, and therefore it's a damn duty of an intellectual to say something about what the future could look like. As the queen of peace research, Elise Boulding, always said, you won't get people to work for something if they cannot imagine it. Imagination is a very important thing. So let me rush on to the first word, democracy. In the West, we can vote, but we cannot select. We can vote for people who some people in parties have put on a list where you can say, I'd vote for this rather than that person. And that is done by maximum 1% to 2% of the people of the West who are permanent working members of political parties. I'm not talking about those who go and vote every 4th year. I'm talking about those who are active in parties. It's one of the smallest movements in the Western world. That's those who are members of a party. And we have the guts to call China a dictatorship with a main party that's not the only one, as you know, which has 90+ million members. That is 7% of people over 18 in China. And these people are not like those in the West who are members of parties. They are well educated. They have to pass an exam to become a member of a party. And they're committed to the development of the country, whereas in the West, you can be a member of a party, 3 different parties in a week, just if you pay, $20 or something like that for an annual subscription to the party. You don't have to do anything. Lots of the Western democracy is now being destroyed by the West itself, because some of the preconditions is free speech, free media, etc., and we all know, those of us who are in this business, that it doesn't exist anymore, or is being circumscribed very, very much. On a different level, democracy has always been lacking behind, in the sense that we have no global democracy, but we have a globalized, or whatever you would call it, globally tending economy, investments, trade, etc., and we have a globally thinking finance world, and we have a globally thinking military world. But democracy is still limited to each nation state. I can vote for who is in the Parliament of Stockholm or Denmark in Copenhagen. I cannot vote for anybody else. That is, of course, meant to be like that because we have actually no direct influence of who is running the international system. So what we need is global governance in a democratic way, and we've got to think about ideas and proposals on how to do that, because at the moment we don't have it. I'm coming up with some suggestions to it in a little while. Because unless we have a much more democratic global decision-making or global governance, not global government, I don't see how we're going to run this world with all its billions of people and problems and challenges that we are facing in the future. But we're always talking about democracy in a national framework. Now, democracy, in my view, and I'm very happy Professor Sakharov talked about this, because he and I are obviously staunch believers in the UN Charter. No matter how much countries have destroyed the UN, we still have the normative power, the soft power, if you will, of the Charter. And there's no reason why we can't have a discussion about how to reform the UN until somebody comes up with something better. I'm very tired of people, also good-hearted people, who say, oh, the United Nations is ridiculous. Look at Srebrenica and look at this and that, and it's marginalized and it's without values. No wonder it is when the world spends 300 to 400 times more on arms than on the United Nations, all it does. Is that the priorities we want in the future? Are these the priorities that will create a better world? Of course not. For we need a reform because the UN, as it is today, of course, is slightly outdated. But it is the best foundation for building something better. And by that I mean particularly the preamble and Article 1, which all nations and all countries basically ignore 24/7, that peace shall be established by peaceful means. And that the only right we have to use military is Article 51, the right to self-defense. We are far away from it, and we need to use the normative power of the Charter to hold countries and peoples and the priesthood of militarism accountable for the destruction of international law and the norms we already have established. That is time to remind ourselves about that. Okay, we need a reformed Security Council, we know that. I would suggest that we have an Environmental and Development Council too, not just a Security Council. And by the way, the Security Council does not make any security because it covers 80% or more of the world's arms trade, the members sitting there. We need a UN Parliamentary Assembly of CSOs, that is civil society organizations, non-represented peoples, children and youth, culture and peace organizations, etc., all directly elected by the people, the citizens of the member state. What a bizarre world we have. It's called we the peoples, but who are sitting at the United Nations today? It's we the governments who have appointed ourselves. No, I don't know. I've never voted for the one who represents Sweden in the United Nations. Why can't we have elections about people who represent our countries internationally? There's no technical reason we shouldn't be able to do that. If we can vote for which is the best song in Europe through SMS, why shouldn't we be able to do international voting for who should represent our country and us in international organizations? We need in the UN to have hearings, fact-finding, reports, and advocacy inside the House, and direct elections to those who sit in the UN and all other international organizations that profess to represent us as citizens. We live with the consequences, but we have no influence on it. Madame von der Leyen in the European Union is appointed at dinner parties. You call that democracy? And of course, we need United Nations media. They have excellent media, they are never quoted anywhere. Only Associated Press, Reuters, and all these more or less fake organizations are quoted. We need United Nations embassies in each country. People who consider represent what the UN stands for and what has been decided and check whether the national governments and the member states are following up and aligned with what they have voted for, and have a dialogue all the time about global governance at the local capitals. And we need, of course, UN or world governance ministers in each member state, as long as we have states. All this will be perfectly possible the day the US empire has fallen. And I predict it will happen within 5 years. I know it's dangerous to predict things like that, but it will not hold for long. All the things we meet and talk about, Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, Iran, Israel, whatever will come up, Cold War against China, my dear friends, it will not last. It cannot be understood by rational analysis, political science, or international relations anymore. We need theology, cosmology, psychiatry, psychology, and things like the very dangerous groupthink theories to understand what is going on today. I'm sorry, but we have lost rational analysis and discussions, and it's run by emotionalism in the Western 15% of humanity. And that's a whole new way we need to understand what is going on instead of talking about traditional political science or international relations, in my humble view. Second, the word peace in the headline I'm supposed to address. It's actually very simple. Everybody knows what a war is, but if we ask what is peace? Everybody knows what images of war is. Smashed houses, dead children. If I ask what is an image of peace, well, it's somebody like two young people holding hands while the sun goes down. How damn boring. Peace is much more complex and simple. Complex and simple. Peace is to develop security and secure development for the whole human being and all human beings. Period. There's got to be something that secures that a society develops in terms of socioeconomic development, civilization development. A reason to exist because we think we will also be here tomorrow and will continue working for a better society. And there can be no security or peace if we do not care for that civil society and its development. So therefore, peace is to develop security and secure development for the whole human being, not just materially, but immaterially too, spiritually, and for all human beings. It's exactly like medicine. What does a good doctor do? He or she does diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. Most scholars today do diagnosis. Some predict nuclear war, which I'm totally against saying. It's very destructive psychologically to say there will be nuclear war. And they have absolutely no idea about treatment and healing. It characterizes social science in the West to have no good ideas, but very good analysis of what is wrong. And then we leave it to politicians to make it a better world. Look at where we have ended up. So a good doctor is one who reduces illness, bacteria, cancer cells. And a good peace researcher is one who tries to reduce all kinds of violence. All kinds of violence, not just political or other violence. Now, my dear mentor, Johan Galtung, who died recently under very tragic circumstances, said, put peace first and then secure it. Because the security thinking we have at the moment cannot produce peace. I think it's awfully simple. Johan was very good at saying simple things that was based on complex thinking and quite some knowledge. Put peace first and then secure it, because the present builds on national security, military security, and the utterly stupid, counterproductive idea of offensive deterrence. Deterrence means, first of all, I think you're a bad guy and therefore I have to deter you. That's not a good way to start a conversation. Do you deter your spouses? Do you deter your children? No, you don't. You trust them. You cooperate with them. You don't start out saying, you're a bad guy and therefore I have to deter you. And secondly, if you believe in deterrence, the deterrence should be defensive. Offensive deterrence means that I am able to kill you where you live, 5,000 or 7,000 kilometers away, and that should deter you from doing what I don't want you to do or deter you to do what I demand that you do. There's never ever going to be peace by that way of thinking. And that's why I, 2 years ago, wrote a rather long story, 150 pages, 30 arguments why NATO must be abolished, because it builds on that thinking. There is nothing else. Intellectually, there's virtually nothing in NATO apart from repetition. But it builds on offensive deterrence. That is, my security is supposed to be built by being able to kill you. And so that's where we are. Put peace first, make peace, learn civil conflict resolution, do early warning, have the organizations up, get peace ministries, get peace education going. Remember Gandhi. He was a bit more wise than Mr. Stoltenberg. And then we have defensive defense. That means I only have weapons that I can defend my territory with if you come to me. The symbol of all this, of course, is the Great Wall of China. It doesn't threaten anybody, but it's not that easy to get over. And if you are unhappy with the military, then have a combi defense, which it will be, I know, hardly 20 minutes yet, according to my Swedish watch. If you want military, that's one thing. We cannot put everybody in prison who does not want military. So you have civil defense, you have civil disobedience, you have civil resistance, and you train people in creating a resistant society to international bullying. That is increasing every society's self-reliance in times of crisis. So, I'll end here. If we do these things, cooperation will come automatically. If we do what I said about security and peace, and we do a more democratic world decision-making governance thing, cooperation will become the natural thing. Not confrontation, not hatred, not deterrence, not threats, not enemy images, but friend images. It's totally possible, friends. That's how we organize family lives and national lives and organizations with associations of people we have something in common with. And the idea of a common future means cooperation. There is only coexistence or no existence. So remember George Bernard Shaw. If cannibalism, slavery, child labor, and absolute monarchy have been abolished, denounced in the name of militarism, so we can denounce militarism, warfare, most kinds of violence, and abolish militarism. Militarism is the curse over any other curse of the Western world at the moment. We are militarizing ourselves to death, and we don't have to. So think constructively. What are we for? What kind of visions can we have and work together to achieve? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Oberg. Sorry, the time is very short, but we have a proposition for this panel. And yes, yes, Swedish minute. Thank you. Thank you to all of you, Professor, for your extraordinary commitments and contribution to our first panel. We have only, as Macedonian time shows, we have only 15 minutes for the session of question and answers. I would like to invite my students, Mila and Bojan, please help us to deliver microphones. Thank you. So, Your Excellency, you would like to take a floor? Yes, please. Okay. Yes, you can use. Thank you.
I think it will be much easier. Thank you very much. I'll be as brief as possible, taking into account that we've got only 15 minutes left. Dear participants of the conference, dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this international conference, the Global Challenges Center at the St. Cyril and Methodius University in Skopje, and its head, Professor Biljana Vankovska, for inviting me to take part in it. The importance of the conference can hardly be overestimated. It is the first time in the last few years that an event of this kind is held in Skopje with participation of political scientists and experts who enjoy well-deserved authority and respect throughout the world. And that's to put it mildly. The key role in bringing you all together, while at the same time addressing a huge number of issues, certainly belongs to Professor Vankovska. And I would like to take this opportunity to express my deep respect for her efforts, as well as for her scientific and public activities. Thank you. Themes of the conference: cooperative multipolar system in quest for a new world order. Of its plenary session and panel discussions are, of course, of particular interest nowadays. The relevance of the issues chosen for consideration seems to have been on the steady rise in recent years. And I think one can easily explain it. We all live on one planet Earth, and one of the guarantees of continuation without exaggeration of the very existence of human civilization is recognition of objective parameters and principles of the world order, development of mutually acceptable rules of interaction between states and associations of countries, and their strict and consistent observance. But for this purpose, it is necessary to determine at what stage of humanity's development we are, what realities do characterize it now, and what trends will determine prospects of this development, at least for the foreseeable future. Indispensable condition for success in solving these global-scale tasks is intellectual honesty of researchers and experts, including rejection of propaganda cliches and seemingly common images of the enemy. Those are used today by the elites of many countries to divert attention from their own mistakes, miscalculations, and often crimes, and not only against other countries, but also against their own people. I will not waste time listing many instances. Those present here are well aware of them. I believe it is worth noting that today we have already heard numerous examples of such intellectual honesty from the keynote speakers, Professor Weiwei, Professor Desai, Professor Sacco, and Professor Orberg. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of you for your inspiring and analytical speeches. Each one of them provides a good amount of food for thought, so much needed these days. The underlying theme of your statements is the recognition of formation of a multipolar world, a good starting point for any subsequent discussions. A few words about the way Russia approaches the issues on the conference agenda. And we do not claim in any way that we are absolutely right. However, recognizing the high level of knowledge and professional qualifications of the participants, I consider it important to share our vision of the processes taking place in international relations. Of course, limiting myself to the conference agenda. Let me say right away, we have never ever hidden anything on this matter. President Vladimir Putin has commenced on these issues as openly and in detail as possible for many, many years to come. Our general position is explained in the concept of the foreign policy of the Russian Federation, approved by President of Russia last March. This is an open, multi-page document translated into several languages and accessible to all interested parties. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with it. Still, several thoughts. The formation of a fair and sustainable world order is one of the priority tasks of the foreign policy of the Russian Federation. We proceed from the fact that a multipolar system, tendency towards a multipolar system, now and for many years to come, is the reality of international relations, whether someone likes it or not. Possibility of dominance by one country or group of countries is becoming a thing of the past, faster and more definitely with every day. It is clear to the countries of the global majority that confrontation and hegemony do not solve global problems. On the contrary, they only multiply them. The examples are all around us. The collective West attempts to restrain this objective process. However, it's impossible to reverse it. Changes that the modern world has entered into are fundamental and irreversible. It is important to clarify here that a multipolar world order is not an artificial multilateralism. And here I somehow have to oppose Professor Desai what you were talking about multilateralism. That a number of countries of the collective West are now trying to promote. Despite its seeming similarity, multilateralism serves the so-called, as we see it, rules-based order. These rules are dictated by Washington, sometimes by the number of European capitals. But interestingly, no one has ever seen them. They're not written down anywhere. They're invented, as they say, on the fly, and imposed on the international community with one goal: to perpetuate the global hegemony of the West, to maintain its accelerated economic growth, to continue to appropriate foreign resources, to retain monopoly of the US dollar, and so on and so forth. It is important to note that countries that try to live by these rules, or that are forced to live by them, create conditions in which they themselves risk one day become the object against which those very rules will be used. Feel the difference. Multilateralism is almost always directed against someone. Yesterday, for example, it was against the Soviet Union. Today, against autocracies, which first and foremost means Russia and China. I'm sorry to say that. A powerful toolkit is used, from financial and economic sanctions and information campaigns to direct military and political pressure, attempts to strategically defeat Russia, cancel Russian culture and history, or they create alternative narrow formats of decision-making bypassing the United Nations. Now let us take a multipolar system. And I have to give credit, Professor Sakwa, to your very interesting characteristic that multipolarity is ideology. I'll have to think of that deeper. Multipolar system is always about cooperation, a joint search for mutually beneficial answers to the most difficult issues. It is based on honest and understandable, for most countries, terms, or we call them principles. These are sovereign equality of states, respect of their right for a model of development and social, political, and economical order, cooperation based on a balance of interests and mutual benefit, non-interference in internal affairs, cultural and civilizational diversity, reliance on spiritual and moral values which are common for all the world traditional religions and circular ethnic systems, rule of international law in regulating interstate relations based on the UN Charter in its entirety and interrelationship, indivisibility of security both globally and regionally. I've named just a few. 2 minutes. The multipolar world is a reality. The number of states advocating a just and truly free world order is growing. New centers of power and economic growth are emerging and getting stronger. These are, first of all, the BRICS members and those states that wish to join it and understand prospects of equal cooperation taking into account national interests. Let me remind you, and here I have to correct, Professor Weiwei, your figures. Last year, in 2023, the share of the BRICS countries in global GDP was 36%, while that of G7, 30%. And this gap is becoming wider. BRICS sees its task in combining economic potentials, creating a space of opportunities for all those interested in harmonious, mutually beneficial in the common interests of all of our countries and peoples cooperation. I'm certain that the results of the upcoming BRICS summit in Kazan in Russia in less than 3 weeks' time will undoubtedly confirm attractiveness of the format. More than 30 leaders have confirmed their participation in the summit. Of course, Russia is an integral part of the multipolar world, but we can keep building it only together. In fact, President Putin recently spoke about it while he stressed the need to unite efforts for the sake of sustainable development and universal, equal, and indivisible security. On my own behalf, I'm 100% sure that there is no alternative to this, and the reasons should be absolutely clear to everybody. I think I shall stop here in order not to misuse hospitality. Finally, allow me to wish to all the participants of the conference successful and fruitful work and interesting discussions full of argument. As we know, only as a result of such discussions one can find or at least come nearer the truth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And now before I closing this panel, we have time only for one short question. Do we have any interested? Professor Konstantin, please take the microphone.
Thank you very much. I'm Konstantin Minovski, sociologist, colleague of Biljana from the University of Cyril and Methodius. It is very difficult to have one short question after all these
Yes, I know,
discussions.
we have agenda.
I know that you have agenda, but I will summarize it in one question now. Are we challenging the capitalism? Are there alternatives to capitalism today?
Okay, thank you. Who would like to answer? Professor Radika, please.
This is a really interesting question, and of course, I'm sure all my co-panelists will have had the same problem. There is so much to say and so little time that while I referred to capitalism, I kept one of the most important aspects of what I have to say. I wasn't able to include it, and that is that we are living in a time when the decay of capitalism is manifest. In the homelands of capitalism, it has become unproductive, financialized, it is deindustrializing these societies. Meanwhile, in the premier socialist country, namely China, you have a prodigious expansion of productive power of a sort not before seen. So I will simply say that this corresponds to two quick things. Number one, well, three quick points. Number one, Marx had long ago said that once capitalism arrives at its monopoly phase, which it kind of did by the early 20th century, it was past its sell-by date. It was ripe for socialism. Lenin, in his famous pamphlet, which is rarely read and more often quoted, also refers to the same idea, which is why he called imperialism the highest stage of capitalism. And he was right in many ways. So thirdly, I would say that, thirdly, I would say that at this point in time, the question is not what are the alternatives to capitalism. The point is capitalism is finished. So how are we going to create, what are we going to replace it with? This is an urgent point. And I would say that every country will come up with its own particular pattern. And I don't, we can have a terminological discussion. The Russian ambassador said that, thought he was objecting to what I was saying, but in fact he isn't. We're just calling the same things different names. But be that as it may, it really doesn't matter what's in a name at the end of the day, So the point is every country will try in its own way to build a more egalitarian, a more productive, a more sustainable, and a more peaceful society. And if we all do that in our own way, I have no problem with that. And that is where we are headed, because there is no alternative. Capitalism is not going to provide us with a system that can achieve these objectives. Thanks.
Yes, Professor Weywey.
Well, perhaps I could, use China as an example to illustrate why capitalism is somehow doomed. I just make an interesting comparison between China and the United States. Because usually people compare economies, countries, with GDP or per capita GDP. As US GDP or GDP of many Western countries are highly inflated because 80%, 75% are services, which is really, Chinese talk about real economy, substantial economy. So I said, let's change this, whatever. I selected 5 items to compare Shanghai and New York. Xinjiang and Mississippi. In other words, I divide China into developed part and less developed, and divide United States into developed part and less developed, and then compare. The 5 indicators are household net assets, median level. Shanghai is better than New York. Life expectancy, Shanghai is 4 years longer than New Yorkers. China is 2 years longer. And infant mortality, Shanghai is lower. General sense of security, safety, Shanghai 10 times better. Infrastructure, Shanghai is 20 years ahead. But in terms of per capita GDP, New York is 4 times higher than Shanghai. Something must have gone wrong. Same with Xinjiang, with Mississippi. Xinjiang, 3 years ago, its life expectancy was 74, and Mississippi was 72. So with this kind of comparison, you will see. So now China model, like as the first sentence of the Communist Manifesto, it's like, what's in English? It's haunted. The specter of communism haunts the Western powers, whatever. China model haunts the West today. So they try to